there's no question, at least for me, that Part 4 opens with one of the most emotive and evocative dramatizations. And that's the moment they're bringing Ivan Kuritsyn to the cage for his execution. This whole Russian connection to the seventh day, how does that work? I mean, how do we get to that execution moment?
In this particular story, we have a story that lasts 25 to 35 years, all right, during the last part of the 1400s. Okay? And it was a movement, a reform movement actually, within the Russian Orthodox Church. It happened that it started in the city of Novgorod, which is a city, on the map today it would be like halfway between Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Okay.
It was a sort of an independent city, and initially was actually not even within the realm of Ivan III, who was the first Tsar. Okay, but when he took it over, he found this Reformation, this movement going on there.
And this is within the Russian Orthodox Church,
Within
this
the
reform movement.
Exactly.
All right.
In fact, it appears that a couple of priests, I think we even mentioned this in Part 4, Alexei and Dennis. He brings them back to Moscow and installs them in a couple of very important cathedrals there. But this movement was very popular. It was even popular with the Tsar himself. The movement was anti-icons.
Okay.
For example.
Which is significant for an Orthodox church because icons are huge.
Yeah. But also, I think a big reason why the Tsar was in favor of it was because these reformers said the church shouldn't own so much land. You know, and if the church didn't own it, who was going to own it? Well, the Tsar would own it. So. But they also taught the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath.
And taught the seventh-day Sabbath, sanctity of the seventh-day Sabbath.
Absolutely, absolutely. In 1490, as we show in Part 4, in 1490 there was a church council at Moscow in which these heretics, as we could call them now, were condemned because of the terrible things they had done to the icons. I mean, they had said bad things about the icons. They'd burned them. They'd thrown them in the trash. All right. Various ones had done different things with regard to the icons, but according to the pronouncement of that church council, all of you have honored Sabbath more than Sunday. And their word for Sunday, it's clear. The Russian word for Sunday is the word, the day of resurrection. All right. So you've all honored the Sabbath more than you have the resurrection day. So this was a common thing that bound these reformers together, and this included people high up in the
imperial
Russian
circle.
Exactly. This fellow Ivan Kuritsyn, he had a brother whose name was Fyodor Kuritsyn. Fyodor Kuritsyn was like the second guy in Russia. He represented the Russian government all over Europe. Not only that, he was an author.
And he's a Sabbatarian.
He was also, at least we know that he was sympathetic toward this movement.
All right.
This is the man who wrote the first Dracula novels as political satires. So he was a very important guy.
He also arranged the marriage of the king's son with Elena, who was very prominent in the Sabbath-keeping movement.
Yeah. Now it happens that the Tsar ends up with his household, in which he has his daughter-in-law, who is now widowed because his son, her husband, had passed away. His daughter-in-law and his grandson,
Who's the heir?
Sabbatarians.
who were both Sabbatarians,
Right.
both promoted, supported, helped this movement, and then his wife, who was now was actually his second wife, and her son,
Sophia,
who were against that movement. So they're in his own household. He's got his daughter-in-law and grandson on one side. He's got his second wife and her son on the other side, and they're all pushing, for their own agenda.
And in case the viewers haven't watched Part 4 yet, we'll not tell them how the story ends.
Don't tell them how that ends.
Give me the rough date again for this.
Well, this would have begun, let's just say roughly from 1470 to 1505,
All right.
roughly.
Now let's do a little human interest sidelight. No history involved now.
Okay.
But back to that dramatization. The man who plays Ivan Kuritsyn.
Yeah.
A very interesting story
Not
that
an actor.
Jeff Wood told me.
Yeah, not an actor. We had rented his wife's store to do our Ethiopian scene-in for part 4. And he looked like a great guy to play the part.
And
he
boy,
did
does
a
he do
wonderful
it
job.
powerfully. If you're going to watch this, you get to that opening moment, you'll see how powerfully, in fact, he does play that part.
In fact, it was cold that night. It had snowed 2 days before.
And this is up in Canada
Up in
when
Victoria.
you're shooting. Okay.
And even that much snow up there isn't very common, but it had snowed a couple of inches, and it was still melting. It was cold out there that night, and we kept wanting to bundle him up, you know, in
Shirley
between the
went to-
camera going. And he said, no, he says, I think I need to be cold to really get into this part.
And where was
it's
that
powerful.
there? Where was this actually
This was
happening?
out in a parking lot, right down by the water's edge, right in downtown Victoria.
Oh, now you just ruined the whole scene for me.
If you lift the camera up just a little more, you see the lights. It was, you know, it was
the Parliament building?
November, so
Oh,
it was
really?
right before Christmas. Yeah.
Dwight, there's another little backstory to this thing, though,
Okay.
to this Russian story.
Okay.
This was not the first time that the Sabbath issue had cropped up in Russia, and in Novgorod in particular. And we talked before about getting experts and how we find experts. We had to dig for other new research too. And this is just an example of what happens. I went to the New York City Library, great library for reference stuff.
Okay.
In fact, it's purely a reference library. You can't go there to the main.
To check out a book.
Yeah, you can't check out a book. You go in there and you make up a list of books and you turn it in, and they bring you this ultimately the stack of books. So I was researching this very thing, the story of the Sabbath prior to the story that we've been talking about here. All right? So I've got a stack of books, probably have 10 to 15 books, all right? And I waited so long, my time was running out. I'm rushing through this stack of books, and I go book after book after book, and I come up empty-handed until I come down, I open the very last book at the bottom of the pile, the last book, and here's a book that is written by a leader of the Russian Orthodox Church who is describing modern heresies in the appendix. And in the appendix, he mentions the fact that these modern heretics who are observing the Sabbath are doing the same thing as, and he mentioned this word, the Strigolniks. And he mentioned the time. The Strigolniks were a period 100 to 200 years before this Moscow Novgorod story. So we're able, if you look far enough and long enough, you come up with stuff that otherwise you'd easily pass by.
You're kind of like the Sherlock Holmes of research.
A lot of,
Well, you know,
Fascinating.
we're talking about the Orthodox Church. You know, they're connected to the Greek Church.
Sure.
They're all part of the same big federation. It's
true.
And the Greek Church had their issues over Sabbath in the 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, 12th, 13th century. We're talking about the Strigolniki.
Yeah.
You know, who knows what the connections are between
Same as
all
the
of them during
Strigolniks that I
that
just
time.
mentioned.
Right,
Okay.
Strigolniki. Right.
Let me shift gears on that. We have the medieval Inquisition,
Yeah.
and we have the modern Inquisition. What's the difference?
When you think of the modern Inquisition, if you connect it to Columbus, you'll be right on target.
The modern Inquisition?
Yes, and the reason is this.
1492.
Exactly, because it was Ferdinand and Isabella who you know, they had married and had united Spain by their marriage,
Okay.
all right? And they became known, and they are still known today, as the Catholic monarchs. It was Isabella herself who requested of the Pope to authorize an inquisition in Spain.
And over in Russia, our priest over there really liked what the Spanish Inquisition did.
The
You know,
priest-
how
the- the-
effective it was.
Yeah, the bishop who was against these
Donati.
Sabbatarians. Yeah. He had heard about the Spanish. It was in its early years at that time. He said, I like what they're doing over there. Let's do it here in Russia too. So the Inquisition was initiated. The modern Inquisition was initiated by Queen Isabella, the Queen Isabella, who sent Columbus on
Isn't
this
that
voyage.
something?
Yeah.
De la Fuente.
Constantino Ponce.
Yeah, what did you have to leave out in that story, in part 4?
Well, we didn't tell the details about his arrest and what led to his arrest, but as far as the story of his position there in that church, Pat and I have been there in that.
It was the
cathedral.
largest cathedral in Europe. It took, 200 years to build.
Yeah.
And very influential church and very influential position he was in.
Yeah.
And
Actually,
here he is sneaking the Bible in on the side. You know, he and his group of friends, they call themselves the Christian,
the secret,
the secret Christians.
Christian church.
They call
Secret
themselves.
Christian Church, yeah.
That church is a fantastic place. It was actually a mosque, and the church was built on the site of this mosque. The tower of this church is large enough. It has a ramp in it. It's large enough so that two or three horsemen can ride side by side from ground level up this ramp to the top of this church. It's a huge. In fact, Dwight, they have done studies within the last 20, 30 years of the cubic area encompassed
Of that cathedral.
Of that cathedral. It is the largest cathedral in the world.
Yeah.
Larger than St. Paul's in London, larger than St. Peter's in Rome. It is the largest.
You know, the roof lines, I mean, there's so many different roofs and there all these little gingerbready things, and it's just magnificent.
And they say that when he preached, he was so popular that the crowds would just throng the streets when they knew he was speaking. But this guy was known all over Europe. He had traveled around as part of the imperial entourage, as like an honorary chaplain.
He was King Philip's personal chaplain, wasn't
Philip II, who was actually the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire.
Sabbatarian? No.
But
secretly.
but the Sabbatarian angle of this is part of the tragic story. And here's what it is. Constantino was part of this, what we just said a few moments ago, this secret Christian church. It was actually a lay person in Seville who had ministered to priests and had convinced them of new ideas, very un-Catholic ideas about how you're saved and so forth. Well, this was a relatively small group, an intimate group. Constantino had written a book. In his book, he wrote about the Sabbath. He talked about the Sabbath being a day that God had set aside sort of as a tithe, so that there would be a time when we could offer to God a recognition of our Creator and so forth. But then he added in that book, he said, I'm going to write more about this subject in my next book. Now, Constantino's writings were hidden. I mean, he was exposed enough because the inquisitors could hear him when he preached, and as we mentioned in part 4, he was questioned numerous times.
Over and over again.
Yeah. But his writings were hidden in the wall of a home of one of the members of this secret Christian church, and he was safe until the time when by a fluke those writings were uncovered in that hiding place in that house. And when those were uncovered, then he was arrested, and as we know, a few months later he died. But so we never got to hear what he was going to write more about the Sabbath. He said, I'll write more in my next book.
Never got that book.
We never got that book.
Anabaptists. Our community of faith traces its roots back to Anabaptist heritage. But Anabaptist Sabbatarians, you have more to bring up than you mentioned in part 4?
You know, the story that we tell in part 4 is the story of Oswald Glate and Andreas Fischer. All right. So the place where Fischer eventually died was this castle at Krasna-Horka, which we have visited. Krasna-Horka is in southern Slovakia. Now, across the border to the south is Hungary.
Okay.
Well, Hungary was known back in those days as Transylvania. Okay.
You talk about the man whose wife was
yes,
executed.
yes,
That's such a sad story. I don't know if
Yes.
we want to let it out of the bag here, but I guess
Well, he was the man who was hung as well, and
Yeah.
you know, but
Stay hanging.
but the fellow who has done probably the most extensive and in-depth research on that movement, on the Sabbatarians.
Sabbatarians.
That's Daniel Lichty, who is our expert there on that story.
Right.
He also had tantalizing evidence from Transylvania, Hungary, which was just south of where Andreas Fischer had been working. And he says that among the Unitarians there, there was Sabbatarianism, clearly Sabbatarianism. Not only Sabbatarianism, but also observance of Jewish food laws. All right?
Is that right?
And he says that the evidence of this comes clear down to the time of the Second World War, when Jews from that area were being taken to internment camps. And these Unitarians, non-Jews, who were observing Sabbath, who were observing the Jewish food laws, were threatened themselves with internment.
Fascinating.
See, and they could ferret these people out by going to the kitchen and seeing what the women used for grease in the kitchen.
Good night.
If they were using lard, then they were okay. But if they were using like goose fat, they must be allied with the Jews. So these people, many of them, according to Lichty, many of them had to decide for themselves whether they would go into the internment camps with the Jews or give up their Jewish type practices. And that comes right down to, obviously, as I said, the Second World War.
That is something.
Yeah.
One last item on Anabaptists, Pat, the Princes of Liechtenstein.
Yeah, not too far from the area we've just been talking about is what was Nikolsburg. It's just over the border from Austria into the Czech Republic now. And there's a big castle there that was built and owned by the Princes of Liechtenstein, who themselves were Sabbath keepers, some of them, and who also supported and invited Sabbath-keeping Christians to be protected in the area of their domain there. So that's just a little piece. We don't know a lot about it, but I'm assuming they were probably the Anabaptist Sabbatarians that were part of their community too.
So there's a real heritage there in that part of the world.
The Seventh-day Men. I mean, they're called the Seventh-day Men. What's up with that, Jim?
Well, these were people who really came along with that whole Reformation, continuing the Reformation in England. You know, the English Reformation was really pronounced by the king. The Pope is no longer in charge. I am.
Henry VIII?
Henry VIII.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to have my wife, so let's get the Pope out of here.
Pope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in other words, the Catholic Church was the Catholic Church one day. The next day, it was the Church of England. It was still basically the same kind of operation. Just didn't owe its allegiance to the Pope. So within that environment of this reform having, quotes, happened, people said it really hasn't happened. We need more reform. And it was in the environment of pressing for more reform, moving further away from the Church of Rome, that, for example, the Puritan movement arose. And the Puritan movement became sort of the seedbed for the Sabbatarian movement. The Puritan movement...
And explain that. How would it be the seedbed?
Well, the Puritan movement provided for a more extreme kind of Reformation, all right? Pulling further and further away from anything that seemed Romish and Popish, and all the rest, all right? And the Sabbath, in the Puritan mind, the Christian Sabbath was Sunday, all right? So there was a real push to sort of make Sunday a real Sabbath. And so the Puritans would criticize, for example, secular activities on the Sabbath. When the Book of Sports was published, 1617, here was this big Puritan reaction. The Book of Sports was the king saying, here are all the good things that people should be doing on Sunday. It was amusements and things.
And it was, he even published it because there was such agitation over it. There was different views of Sabbath, and to this day there is. There is the view that there is no Sabbath because the law is done away with, but we worship on Sunday because we honor the resurrection. And then there was the Puritans saying, no, Sunday is the Sabbath. We need to make it more like a Sabbath. We need to keep it holy and stop doing all this secular stuff on Sabbath. And then came along the Sabbatarian Sabbaths, Sabbatarian people who said, no, let's go back to the real Sabbath, which is the seventh day, not Sunday at all. So you had all these different groups, agitating each other, and out of this, King James, said, let's decide what we really can and can't do on that day. So then the Book of Sports was published. But that was also Reformation era. So the whole concept of the Catholic Church being the whore of Babylon, was prominent That was the Reformers' view, and they did not mince words.
They were not
when they
real
talked
charitable.
about the Catholic
No,
Church.
no, real charitable.
No, I mean,
Not
one of these
diplomatic.
guys in England, you know, called the church the triple-crowned little horn changer of times and laws. Right out of Daniel.
So in other words, these Seventh-day men were saying, you want reform? You want to reform the Sabbath? Let's
do it
get
the
back
right
to the
way.
real Sabbath. Let's get back to the real Sabbath.
And they agitated in every major denomination. You know, there were Seventh-day keepers in Baptists, among the Baptists, among the Calvinists, in the Church of England itself. There were independents who believed, you know, we should do everything that the Jews do, include the dietary laws and the, you know, everything that the Jews do, we take on ourselves. There was every mentality and every perspective there boiling together.
But some of the arguments of these Seventh-day men, they hold water today, don't they? But you know, we ought to talk about a couple of the experts in part 4.
You like O'Malley?
Yeah, though O'Malley is a Jesuit historian. So John O'Malley teaches at this Jesuit seminary in Boston, in Cambridge actually, near Harvard. And he was very gracious and warm, and we talked just a little small talk, you know, before we got into the meat of our discussion. But anyway, we talked about the Council of Trent and about the Reformation. But I asked him a question. I said, tell me how you think the church has changed since the time of the Council of Trent. Now, Council of Trent, just say 1650 for Council of Trent.
And when you say the church, you're talking about the Roman
We're
Church.
talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Has the church changed since that time? He says, oh, yes, it's changed a lot. I said, well, how do you think it's changed? In what ways? He says, it's become much more papal. And so I followed up with this question. Your personal opinion, is that a good thing or a bad thing? He says, I think it's a bad thing.
In other words, it's becoming very much authoritarian.
I think that's
in
what he was
its,
getting at.
response to contemporary need.
Because, you know, the Jesuits today tend to be kind of out on the liberal wing of the Catholic Church. And he sees the centralization of authority as a negative thing.
You want to tell us about Martin?
Yeah, Martin is a teacher at the Jesuit University. He's not Jesuit himself, but teacher at the Jesuit University in Chicago. But his background was a little unusual. He was a convert to Catholicism. He had been raised in a Mennonite society, basically. Right? And he actually wrote quite a lengthy apology, an explanation for why he converted. And long story short, his defense was this: I like to be someplace where there's a place where the buck stops. He says, you Protestants don't have any place where the buck stops. But he was very hesitant about working with us. And I had told him specifically we're interested in a better understanding of the Council of Trent and of the Roman Catholic position on this question of authority. And we exchanged emails, and I thought maybe he was going to be one of the few, because it really only has been a few, that decided not to work with us. But I took one more opportunity to communicate with him, and I said basically this: we want to tell this story about Catholic authority and the decision at the Council of Trent that sort of formalized the Catholic view of authority. Not that it hadn't been formalized before, but they did it. Really, it was a big deal at Trent. I said, we're going to tell this story. I'd like to tell it right. And if we tell it without you, we might not tell it right. So that's why we want you. And so he wrote back and said, yes, okay, I'll do it.
Great.
And actually, I believe, Dwight, he only speaks one time in part 4. But I think that what he says in a brief paragraph just gets so much to the heart of the issue of the way that the Catholic Church views authority. It just clarified the whole thing for me, at least. And I'm just so glad that he was finally willing to do it, even if we only used, you know, one clip from his interview.
When we come back with part 5, let's get into the whole church-state issue as it affects the Seventh Day.